Welcome the chosen ones. Some children scream upon birth, while others gaze through you as if they recall a contract you made before you arrived. That wasn't just a baby. That was a reckoning wrapped up in a onesie. You see, not every kid is meant to be reared. Some are born to awaken, disrupt, and ignite. And when a youngster like you showed up wide-eyed, unsettlingly silent, or smiling at something no one else could see, the room didn't simply disappear. Nonetheless, the spirits did. Many ancient communities did not just foster talented youngsters. They were dreaded. Why? Because it was thought that they had recalled too much from the other side, and occasionally what they recalled had ramifications for others around them. Now, let's speak about you at the age of 2. You weren't just different. You were uncomfortable. The family couldn't explain it, but the elders prayed for you a bit too much. They anointed you with oil, but discreetly. I hope the fire in your eyes goes out. And now is when things turn grim and genuine. A ritual was completed, perhaps not in the forest, not with red candles, but in words, intents, and agreements made to silence you, delay you, and tie you because your gift terrified those who were meant to lead you. So, was it really colic? Or were you spiritually opposing a whole bloodline's efforts to shut you down before you remembered why you came? You are not insane. You aren't theatrical. You were marked. They knew it before you. And now, we're breaking that quiet. Let us discuss about the gift. They attempted to stop, wondering why it terrified big people when you could hardly speak. Number 1. Your gift was more than simply uncommon. It disrupted their power structures. They didn't despise your presence since it was unusual. They despised it because it was disruptive. You need to recognize that most families do not function on the truth. They operate under hidden norms, denial, and emotional contracts. We don't discuss this. We pretend it did not happen. We sweep things under the rug and grin at guests. But then you were born, and without even trying, you shattered the rules. Your present was not wrapped in civility. It came out raw and censored. You felt lives before you understood what a lie was. You referred to things as they were before you could spell the words. You reacted to the energy, not the tone of speech. And it made others around you feel vulnerable. Not in a charming, childish sense, but in a medical one. You were not playing with toys. You were messing with the truth. And reality terrifies individuals who rely on illusion. It wasn't that you were endowed while others were not. Your donation was uncontrollable. It could not be described or subdued. This constituted a concern since individuals in positions of authority, including families, dislike wild cards. They like regularity and credibility. They like to keep their regulations intact. The parent is the source of authority. The older knows better. The youngster obeys. However, your donation did not respect roles. It valued resonance. If anything seemed weird, you backed away. If someone was wearing a mask, you flinched, and they could feel it. Your presence made it difficult for them to pretend. And for those who have formed their identity on faking, this seems like an assault. This is why they silenced you. That is why they laughed at your insides. That's why people called you theatrical, demanding, or too deep. Because severe cuts go beyond what they wish to conceal. Your gift was more than simply uncommon. It was revolutionary. Revolutions don't seek for permission. So, no, they did not dislike you. But they were afraid of what you awakened. Your gift endangered the systems they relied on to feel comfortable, important, and in control. You did not just join the family as a youngster. You entered as a disruption. And they realized right away what would happen if they didn't shut it down quickly. Everything they constructed upon quiet will ultimately crumble. Number 2, they did not fear your screams. They were concerned that you would know while remaining quiet. They didn't get concerned when you wept. They were worried when you didn't. You simply sat there quietly, scrutinizing them with eyes that didn't fit your age. Adults paused in mid-sentence and shifted in their seats, as if they were being observed by something older than time. You weren't loud, yet your stillness was noticeable enough to make others uneasy. You didn't say much, but your presence said volumes, which is what terrified them. You read people before you could read books. You'd look at someone and know instantly that they weren't speaking the truth, didn't like themselves, or were smiling to disguise something deeper. And without realizing it, your face would respond. Perhaps you would frown or grin when no one else did, or just gaze wide-eyed. as if your spirit comprehended something their lips had not expressed. People would comment, "This child is strange," or "Why is she gazing at me like that?" Because deep down, they felt seen, and not the type of seeing that people like, but the kind that makes them feel naked in the worst manner. They couldn't understand how a toddler made them feel criticized, but it wasn't a judgment. It was clarity. You weren't measuring folks up. You were perceiving, and sensing too much in a culture founded on pretending is hazardous, particularly coming from a kid, since adults can dismiss other adults. But when a youngster looks at you with knowing eyes, it feels different. It cuts through rationality and directly into your soul. It forces you to confront issues you haven't faced in years, if not lifetimes. So they labeled you odd or claimed you had a vivid imagination. But they were not dismissing you. They were putting off their own misery. You didn't meet their expectations of what a kid should be. You were not light and naive. You were profound and electrifying, as if you were privy to information you should not have. And they were correct. You did. You knew what. The rooms felt heavy. You recognized which adults were phony grins. You understood who to embrace and who to avoid long before anybody taught you the difference. And all without uttering a word. Number 3, rituals were not limited to witches. It was an arrangement disguised as protection. Not every ceremony involves lights, chanting, and circles in the woods. Some rituals take place in broad daylight, right in front of your eyes, and are disguised as tradition, religion, culture, or love. What they did to you is not always clear. It didn't need to be. That is the point. It was subtle, but spiritually bound. People around you agreed, either quietly or explicitly, that your gift was excessive, too early, and dangerous. So they did what they felt was best. They closed it down. And the scariest part? They called it protection. Perhaps they led you to a spiritual leader, a church, a shrine, or a family elder. Perhaps they prayed over you too hard. Not with love, but with terror. Perhaps they washed you with water, not simply to bless you, but to drown out what they couldn't grasp. These weren't just ceremonial. These were contracts. Quiet ones, agreements that said we'd rather have a regular kid than a brilliant one who makes life more difficult. And make no mistake, the force driving it wasn't always wicked. It was afraid. You shook stuff. Your presence energized the spiritual mood. For those who were unprepared for such a disturbance, the objective became survival rather than truth. So they hid the tying of your gift to keep you secure, quiet, and normal. However, spiritually, it was a shutdown. They did not damage your gift. They wrapped it up and concealed it under layers of perplexity, humiliation, or religious guilt. What you've described as personality idiosyncrasies, social difficulty, or a lack of understanding of your mission might really be evidence of interference. The routine worked for a time. You began questioning yourself. You stopped believing your intuition. You got fuzzy and detached because part of you recalled what had happened, even if your conscious mind does not. The most difficult fact is that the first individuals to mute your voice are often those who profess to love you the most. Fear-based love, however, does not provide protection. It causes paralysis. And now, after so many years, the gift is knocking again. The fog is lifting. The contract is deteriorating. You're beginning to question, feel, and know things like you did previously. Because what they buried had not died. It was just waiting for you to recall number 4. You were seen as tough because they could not lie around you. They didn't call you tough because you were terrible. They described you as challenging because you were honest without even trying. You were not rude. You were not out of control. You just lived in a manner that made others feel they couldn't hide. Most individuals desire to do just that. They seek to hide behind politeness, phony smiles, emotional masks, and familial obligations. You stepped in and smashed everything with your questions, intuition, and energy. You were the youngster who made adults anxious. You observed what others disregarded. You posed questions they were not prepared to answer. You responded to things they believed were buried years before. You'd weep if someone strolled in with veiled hostility. You'd become silent when folks appeared to be okay and couldn't explain why. They just knew it made them uncomfortable. So instead of focusing on themselves, they made you the issue. They didn't know how to lie to you. Not persuasively. It's not comfortable. Something about you revealed the difference between what they stated and how they really felt. You would disrupt the act just by being present. That is why they labeled you as too sensitive or emotional, since your feelings were not random. They were responses to what was truly happening under the surface. Over time, you experienced what they were attempting to avoid. They conditioned you to think that your awareness was the problem, that you needed to calm down, stop overreacting, or stop asking too many questions. But they weren't attempting to help you develop. They were attempting to keep themselves concealed. They needed you to shrink so they could avoid stretching. They needed you to question your instincts, so they didn't have to look at the mirror you held up. Being branded tough was never because you misbehaved. It was about you becoming uncontrollable in a world that values control. It was about you remaining awake in a system that relies on sleepwalking. They had no idea how to cope with someone who hadn't played the game since they were children. So they placed the burden on your shoulders, thinking you'd dull your light before forcing them to face their own darkness. But now that you're older, the truth is emerging. You were never too much. You were just too genuine for others who continued to pretend. Number 5. You awakened generational spirits that had never been challenged since your birth. Something changed in the environment, not just at your house, but also in the spirit world linked to your lineage. You didn't just carry DNA. You have unfinished business. You did not enter as a continuation of the family's narrative. You arrived as an interruption to the sections of the tale that were never intended to be revisited. Did your birth revive things that your ancestors believed were buried decades ago? Old traumas, silent secrets, desperate oaths, and survival pacts were all brushed under the rug so carefully that even your parents were unaware they were repeating themselves. Then you came, and your enthusiasm sparked everything. You did not ask for it. You did not chosen it. However, your sheer presence revealed what had never been healed and reawakened what had never been dealt with properly. This is why things began going bad for you so early. You could not sleep. You had some weird ailments. You felt like you were being watched. You experienced horrible nightmares, sensed energy you couldn't explain, avoided people intuitively, or were profoundly misunderstood for reasons no one could understand. It was not arbitrary. It was resistance. Your life sparked controversy before you had the words to explain it, because your soul challenged what generations had decided to overlook. Some of these entities were not demons as shown in horror films. They were ancient agreements, treaties struck to safeguard the lineage, earn favor, escape repercussions, or keep safe in difficult times. Those agreements included the phrases quiet, compliance, and compromise. Then you arrived with a spirit that refused to be quiet, bow, or fit in. And the terms, you were not born to glorify them. You were born to shatter them. However, they would not be broken without struggle. That is why the conflict in your life did not wait until maturity. It began the minute your light entered a system designed to suppress it. The system didn't care whether you were a baby. The spirits who created the patterns did not wait for you to grow up. They recognized you from the beginning. They saw that you were unusual, not because of your appearance, but because of what you carried. You were not born to repeat the cycle. You were born to stop it, and everything that happened after you realized it. That is why it attempted to stop you before you had the opportunity to recall. Number 6. The elderly saw it immediately and murmured, not celebrated from the minute you arrived. The elders saw something was off with you. Not only are they adorable and unique, but they are also spiritually marked. Before you could speak, move, or create whole ideas, they saw it. They did not need to inquire. Your energy expressed itself. Your aura shattered rooms. Your presence did not mix in. It altered things. This change made them uneasy, even if they never said it out. You have been taught that elders are always intelligent, caring, and protecting. However, not every senior serves as a guardian. Some are gatekeepers, and guardians do not applaud what threatens their gates. They preserve what was. Even if it's obsolete or broken, they fulfill the order. Not always true. And your presence, even as a newborn, did not feel like a continuation. It seemed like an interruption. They looked at you and saw a light that did not obey rules. The sort that burns down masks, the kind that challenges how things have always been done, and instead of celebrating, many of them said, they didn't run to nurture you. They discreetly pondered how to restrain you because they understood that children like you grow into grown-ups who disrupt things, exposing the rot underlying tradition, and force people to reconsider the roles they've built their whole lives around. Some elders attempted to tie you spiritually, emotionally, and socially. They informed your parents that you needed to be punished early. They cautioned that if you weren't managed now, you'd become rebellious later. But revolt was not in your character. The truth was, they couldn't manage it. Others followed a different course. They did not bind you. They just stared quietly, thinking you'd calm down, the light would fade, and you'd forget. Then there were the uncommon handful, the ones who recognized the gift for what it was, who understood precisely what you were carrying and wanted to assist. However, even they were silent, because assisting someone like you means fighting against a whole system, and not everyone is built for such a struggle. So, no, you were not misunderstood simply because you were ahead of the times. You were misunderstood because you interrupted theirs. The whispers were not bewilderment. They represented strategy. Because when the old order meets someone who has come to establish a new one, it never throws a party. It creates resistance. Your diseases, accidents, and behavioral disorders were all disguised forms of warfare. They told you it was only a fever, a phase, childish tantrums, or a disease to be managed. But what they didn't know, or didn't want to know, was that you were under spiritual attack before you could articulate whole phrases. The symptoms were physical, but the outbursts seemed emotional. But behind it all, there was conflict. And the battlefield was not around you. It was within you. Your body was the most accessible target. They couldn't take away your talent, purpose, or knowledge directly. So they attempted to shut you down via the one thing that links spirit and earth, your vessel. That's why you had odd, unexplained illnesses. That is why you experienced mishaps that made no sense or episodes that physicians couldn't completely explain. Some described it as behavioral. Some termed it medical. However, none of it addressed the spiritual layer, which is where the true onslaught was occurring. You were not weak. You were tampered with because your mere existence threatened certain spiritual contracts that had been unquestioned for eons. You were not simply another youngster. You were a disruption to long-standing agreements, and interruptions are always greeted with opposition, particularly those intended to break patterns, speak truth, and awaken others. Your nightmares were more than simply dreams. They included messages, memories, warnings, and even conflicts. You were being drawn into worlds. Your intellect was not yet mature enough to understand, but your soul had already signed up. That's why you could wake up screaming or weary. That's why sleeping felt unsafe. When you raged, your soul fought, and your body felt the consequences. It wasn't simply about emotional immaturity. Sometimes there was energy building, spiritual energy that wasn't sure where to go. You were responding to situations that did not match your frequency, or picking up on suffering that was not yours, but was pushed into your area. People believed you were stubborn, but you were really overburdened emotionally, energetically, and spiritually. You had no words for it yet. You just felt everything and carried more than you should have had to. So, no, you were not just acting out. Your vessel was indicating that something deeper was going on. And now as you look back, you can see what it really was. Early indications of a powerful calling that drew opponents before you even knew who you were. Number 8. You were deemed too inventive to gaslight your pitiful sight. You were not making things up. You were remembering. You were getting. You were reading things that couldn't be seen with your eyes, yet were clearly there. When you talked about the guy in the hallway, no one else could perceive that you were aware of events that were yet to occur. When you saw tension in a room full of happy smiles, they didn't laugh because they assumed you were mistaken. They chuckled because deep down they knew you were correct. The term, too imaginative, did not refer to your innocence. It was all about control. It was an example of gaslighting. Subtle but deliberate. A technique to shield themselves from the discomfort of your precision. If they accepted that you saw what you saw, they'd have to confront something they'd been avoiding for years. Unspoken anguish, generational trauma, secrets, spirits, and energy. And most people prefer to insult the messenger than address the message. You were not dreaming. You were gaining access to areas that grown-ups had previously avoided for decades. Your gift of sight. It was genuine, whether it manifested as sights, sensations, voices, or dreams. And it cut through the layers of denial that others relied on to keep sane. That is why they named it imagination. Because pretending you were a creative youngster was simpler than admitting that the curtain between worlds was thinner around you. This was hardly a harmless mistake. It was spiritual sabotage disguised as care, since every time they rolled their eyes, urged you to stop making up tales, or disregarded what you saw, it sowed seeds of doubt. Over time, that skepticism increased. You began questioning yourself. You began disguising your insights. You stopped talking about what you saw and began wondering whether anything was wrong with you. But there was nothing wrong with you. What was wrong was the world's incapacity to manage the kind of vision you had. They could not explain it, so they deleted it. Not out of hate, but out of fear. Fear that you were touching something they had long sought to forget. Fear that if you shine a light on shadows, they will learn to live with them. They did not call you inventive because they assumed you were lying. They called you that because they knew deep down you were speaking the truth, but they weren't prepared to hear it. Number 9, your gift was not intended to impress. It was to expose. Your gift was never to put on a show. It was not intended to garner plaudits, following, or accolades. It was never about performance. It was for penetrating the illusion. And that is precisely why it alarmed people. You didn't come to entertain. You came to expose. You did not show up to make others feel good. You showed up to make them feel genuine. That type of energy is not welcomed. It is opposed. You were not a youngster who performed parlor tricks. You were a living mirror. And mirrors do not lie. They reflect. You reflected what? People worked hard to conceal their unhealed scars, feigned confidence, and hidden intents. And when others looked at you, they saw more than simply a person. They witnessed everything they were not prepared to confront. That felt threatening. You were quiet about it. You did not point fingers. You simply showed up. And just being in your presence made someone cringe. Because when you carry the truth, others may sense it without saying anything. It hums off of you. It interrupts the stillness. It hangs in the air like static. And some folks couldn't breathe near you. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you triggered something they hadn't repaired. This is why you often got into problems for the wrong reasons. Not because you were horrible, but because you were too correct. You made people feel vulnerable, and they took offense. You weren't intending to harm them. However, discovery is painful when your whole existence has been based on denial. And in a culture that values performance above honesty, your gift seemed like betrayal. You did not flatter. You have disclosed. You did not play along. You saw through the game. And the world does not cheer for that kind of insight. It punishes it, particularly when it comes from someone who is expected to remain little. This is why you have been misinterpreted, mislabeled, and misunderstood. Number 10. You worried grown-ups because you represented their spiritual deadline. You did not just stroll into the room. You carried a countdown with you. Not the sort you hear ticking on a clock, but the kind that resonates in the spirit without saying anything. You reminded folks that time was running out for their denial, habits, and excuses. You weren't just a talented youngster. You sounded a spiritual alarm. Alarm bells do not whisper. They interrupt. Your presence made others uneasy. Not because you were incorrect, but because you arrived on time, exactly on schedule, to face everything they believed they had successfully evaded. Karma, responsibility, shadow labor, and hereditary baggage. They weren't expecting it to appear in the shape of a toddler with weird eyes and inquiries. But it is precisely who you were. A live deadline, a line in the sand, a reminder that their opportunity to adapt, change, and break the cycle was short. And, let's be honest, most people do not dread the future. They are afraid of the bill, which will be due after years of avoiding it. And you were the invoice. You proved that the reckoning would not be accompanied by thunder in the sky. It would be a child peering into their soul with unblinking eyes, asking things they couldn't answer without unraveling. They stared at you with a sense of spiritual terror, not because you were doing anything extraordinary, but because everything about you indicated that you couldn't pretend forever. You were walking closure. And when a person has spent their whole life coping with dysfunction, someone like you does not seem like a godsend. You feel like a menace. Not because you are destructive, but because your truth has an expiry date. They were unafraid of your remarks. They were concerned about your timing because timing carries weight. You arrived just as their illusions were beginning to break, and your presence drove them to make a decision. Evolve or be exposed. Heal or continue to hide. But this is the scariest part for them. You didn't realize you were doing it. You were only being yourself. And yet, you are quiet. Being was proclaiming the end of spiritual cycles. They believed they could extend indefinitely. You were not simply a kid. You were a deadline in diapers. And each time they glanced at you, they saw the clock flashing brighter and louder. Time is up. A number. They thought you would grow out of it rather than into it. They never wanted you to thrive. They wanted you to blend from the beginning. Their unstated desire was that whatever made you unique would ultimately fade, that your sensitivity would harden, your insight would soften, and the sharpness of your awareness would flatten out into something more socially acceptable. You were too bright for a world that had adapted to darkness. Instead of acknowledging it, they attempted to dull it silently. They did not face you openly. They did not assault your gift head-on. Instead, they couched their opposition in etiquette, parenting, and culture. They stated stuff like, "You think too much. Don't be so emotional, and quit being odd." It seemed like advice, but it was really a prayer for your amnesia, a wish that your fire would go out before it burnt through their comfort zones. You were not intended to be understood. You were intended to be regulated, domesticated, and trained to function normally enough to make others feel secure. They couldn't kill what was within you, so they tried repackaging it. They pushed you to conform, perform, and accomplish, thinking that the surface would become your identity. That if you followed enough rules, gained enough praise, and smiled enough, you'd stop listening to your inner voice, the one that always understood when something was wrong, even if no one else did. They praised your brains, but not your instincts. They admired your abilities, but sided with your knowledge since your gifts did not just make you brilliant. They made you prone to delusions. They could see you weren't here to finish the script. You were born to rewrite it. However, altering the screenplay eliminates some roles, and no one wants to lose their part, no matter how bogus it is. So they attempted to domesticate your divinity, teaching you how to be pleasant, dependable, and safe. But the reality is, you were never supposed to outgrow your talent. You were supposed to grow into it. And every time they assumed you were forgetting, you were really remembering in disguise. Growing roots under the surface, silently getting ready for the day. You'd stop apologizing for being yourself. A number. The ritual only worked momentarily. That explains why you felt lost for years. It actually worked for a while. The ceremony, the prayers, the quiet agreements, the energy they released to silence you, tame and confuse you. It went into your system and spirit. You no longer trusted what you formerly knew so easily. You had second thoughts about your findings. You began requesting permission to be who you already were. The fire did not burn out, but it was buried. Buried. Underperformance. Survival. People who are pleased with OBD. It is camouflaged as love. You did not just forget your gift. You forgot about yourself. You've forgotten the clarity you once had. You forgot that some of your feelings weren't rational. They were genuine. You forget that being sensitive was never a weakness. That includes your tears, instincts, and resistance. They were all signals. However, under the pressure to be normal, you sacrificed your knowledge for acceptability. And the trade cost you your orientation. You began living in a fog. Not quite present. Not nearly gone. Just going through the motions, attempting to fit into areas that were never designed for someone like you. And you explained to yourself that this was part of growing up. This represented maturity. But something always seemed odd. Not broken, but misplaced. As if your whole existence revolved on music. You were never supposed to dance to that lost emotion. It was not failure. It was spiritual repression. And now it is wearing off. The amnesia is breaking. The fog is thinning, and not at random. You're not going nuts. You are awakening from a spiritual coma. That is why things seem familiar, even if they are new. That's why you've been experiencing strange dreams or recalling memories that were not previously present. That's why you feel like your past and future are blending together. Because the ceremony only worked briefly, not forever. Your spirit was never completely asleep. It was waiting, watching, and withholding until you were strong enough to regain what had been stolen, which is now. That's why the pain is increasing. That is why the old you is deteriorating. Not because you're losing yourself, but because you've rediscovered who you were before they taught you how to forget. A number. You were born into a lineage that exchanged power for quiet. You were not born into a spiritually dead family. You were born into a society that suppressed its power. Your ancestors retained the ability to summon the invisible. They did not lose their connection with the higher worlds. They exchanged softly and carefully over time. They exchanged actual power for survival, safety, and the semblance of normalcy. And you entered that narrative bearing the same thing they attempted to eliminate. The fact is that many individuals in your genealogy had profound spiritual roots. They were seers, healers, dreamers, spiritual fighters, and could see what others couldn't. People who have abilities derived not from books or instruction, but from something ancient. But somewhere along the way, someone chose quiet. Perhaps out of terror. Perhaps because they felt endangered. Perhaps the world persuaded them they had to choose between strength and peace. And they chose peace. Even if it was the phony type. They did not abandon the ceremonies. They just hollowed them out. The altars remained, but their presence waned. The prayers persisted, but not the fire behind them. Everything became about maintaining appearances, avoiding questioning, and not being seen as unusual. They wore tradition as a garment rather than a calling. And they handed that stillness along as a legacy. Until you did not come here to fit in. You did not come to keep secrets. You did not come to perform like your lineage used to. You come to resuscitate it. You come to summon the flames back. And this makes you dangerous. Not to the world, but to the system your family devised to keep comfortable. You threatened silence. They normalized the numbness. They accepted the concessions they had made. You were not created to dishonor your ancestors. You were born to redeem it, to return and pick up what they dropped, to say the words they were too afraid to utter to complete the spiritual tasks they had left unfinished. And, sure, it makes others uncomfortable because your presence reminds them of what they gave up and what remains hidden under the pretense. You are not the black sheep. You are the bloodline's reckoning, and you did not come to complete the narrative. You come to repair it. A number. You're not just recalling who you are. You are disturbing what they have buried. This is not only a personal epiphany. This is called ancestral interference. Your clarity is more than just discovering oneself. It's about upsetting everything they attempted to conceal, bury, and forget. The more you wake up, the more the foundation of your family's past begins to shake. You're not only healing, you are digging. Not everyone is going to celebrate that. What? Surfacing through you was never intended to happen again. It was hidden under silence, shame, fear, and in some instances, desperate spiritual agreements. They didn't just forget. They opted to forget because remembering has implications. And you, with your uncomfortable talent, spiritual awareness, and stubbornness to remain mute, bear the consequences. You're entering areas where the energy has been stagnant for decades. And just inhaling in your reactivating truth wakes memories they labored diligently to eliminate. Your voice contains the vibrations of predecessors who remained silent. Your instincts are tuned to frequencies that have been forbidden from speech. And when you stop questioning yourself, the moment you stopped shrinking, the moment you began remembering, you did not just transform your life. You began to disturb the spiritual structure designed to keep the true past buried. You aren't only talented, you are a live contrast to the story. They sought to create a narrative that indicated, we're fine now. When the truth was hidden under layers of dysfunction and denial, you weren't meant to be the peacekeeper. You were born to be the unfolder. The prophecy that centuries had dreaded will come true. Because you are coming. It meant the lying had to stop. They attempted to disrupt this moment by quiet, distraction, and making you question yourself. But it did not work. Because what you have is more than simply skill. It's an assignment. And the task is unapologetic. It doesn't care whether it makes others uncomfortable. It does not care whether it is misinterpreted. It came to complete what others were too terrified to begin. You're not just recalling who you are. You're reminding the bloodline of something they forgot. And not everyone is ready for the reminder. But it is here, and it's wearing your face. You were never just a talented youngster. You represented a spiritual occurrence, a soul sent not simply to remember, but to disrupt, to break the stillness that had become a custom, to reawaken the lineage which had forgotten its own fire. Every name they gave you, from challenging to sensitive to creative, was in response to your presence shattering spiritual contracts that they thought would remain sealed. They attempted to tame, rebrand, and quiet you. And for a time, it worked. The routines dull you. Your confidence was weakened by doubt. The strain has rewired your instincts. You become the quieter form of a louder destiny. Even after you were buried, your gift lived on. It sat calmly, monitoring and building strength under the surface. And now it is exploding. You were not brought here to fit in. You were sent here to discover what they buried, to speak for what they silenced, to finish what your forefathers failed to do. That's why your path has been difficult, complicated, and even unpleasant at times. Because you were created to resist on purpose. Even through the fog, you've begun to recall. It's not only about healing. This is about regaining the voice that was ridiculed. It's your weapon now. They disregarded the sight. It's your compass. They attempted to shut off their impulses. They are your confirmation. You are the prophesy. They believed they could cancel. The truth, encased in flesh. Everything they believed they could keep hidden was returned to them. You didn't go through all of this simply to be normal. You are not here for applause. You're looking for alignment, restoring what was sacrosanct. Burn the contracts of fear. To walk is evidence that no ceremony, rejection, or generational repression can undo what was programmed into your soul before birth. They expected you to grow out of it, but you grew into it. And now it is time. It's time to quit apologizing for your clarity. It's time to stop shrinking, to ensure their comfort. It's time to allow the gift they gave us speak. Because your awakening is not just yours. It is the ancient thunder that they attempted to suppress. And it just gets louder. If this triggered something deep inside you, if you felt seen, remembered, or perhaps exposed in the greatest manner possible, don't scroll past it. Subscribe to the channel right now, not only for additional material, but also to remain connected to messages that speak to who you really are, rather than who the world has instructed you to be. Leave a comment below. Tell your tale. Share what resonated with you. Or just leave a comment if this touched your soul. Similar to the video, your voice is important here. It also helps others locate this message. You never know who else is waking up right now and needs this specific word. Sharing it with someone you know has always been unique. The silent ones, the ones who feel deeply, those who saw too much too quickly. This is also their call to memory. This is not just a channel. It is a movement, a digital shrine, a refuge for the misunderstood and given. Those who have fought spiritual wars from infancy. And if this is you, welcome home. God bless you.